trying to get their examinations together, their finals and so on. But I'm glad that some of you have been able to come over to hear this talk by Tim Kirschenheiter, who is a PhD student in the philosophy department here, and is also a teaching assistant in the department. He's also an adjunct instructor of philosophy at Schoolcraft College. And this is only the second time the center has allowed a non-faculty member to give a presentation. This is in this series, but this is because we recognize that, in my mind, philosophy scholars are born faculty. They're just born faculty members, and the topic is so interesting that we thought that this would be a good match for our Brumback series. Tim is a modest young man, so he hasn't given us much to read about his biography, but I can say that he received his bachelor's degree from the University of Indianapolis and his master's in philosophy from Wayne State University. He has presented papers in 14 different states, so he's been a busy scholar, and these papers have been on ethics, epistemology, and the philosophy of religion. But the primary focus of his work has been in sexual ethics, specifically the moral status of non-standard sexual interactions. I wouldn't name all the papers he has given in these 14 states, but just one that is relevant to the talk he's giving today, entitled An Examination of the Moral Status of Incest, Adult and Child Sex, and Necrophilia, which was presented in the spring of 2014. So he is a newcomer to the Brumback series, and his topic is how should ethicists respond to taboo sexual interactions. So without further ado, please welcome to the podium Tim Kirschenheiter.
So there's two main issues we're going to look at today. Just in general, the moral status of what we might call taboo sexual interactions. Take taboo just as like a really broad term referring to just any sexual interactions that in general do not get societal approval. So obviously this will shift over time. Going back 50 years, this would include, say, homosexual sex acts, way less so now. 50 years, you could imagine, might change a bit. So spent a good amount of time on the moral status of those acts. I'm also interested about a subsequent question, and that is potential conflicting roles that a philosopher and ethicist might have, because a philosopher ethicist is also, like all persons, a moral agent. And these are the sorts of issues that promulgating certain claims on them could potentially lead to societal harms, usually through potential misunderstandings, because we're not arguing for harms when I make the sort of claims I'm going to make today, but it's an area that's could potentially have a lot of misunderstandings. So, extra little question there. I think I have good answers for the first question. I do not think I have good answers for the second question. That would at least raise them and hopefully get a discussion going. First thing I want to start off with, though, we'll just go through this outline together for the talk, is the two understandings of sexual ethics, or at least how I'd like to break them down, into uniqueness views and non-uniqueness views. And the basic distinction is going to be concerning whether there are special moral rules for sexual interactions, or whether we're going to apply the same rules as we would apply to all interpersonal interactions. So uniqueness views are going to posit some special moral rules for sexual interactions that aren't really going to apply to other interactions. So like if someone said you're only morally permitted to engage in a sexual interaction with someone with whom you love, well, that would be a standard that would apply to sexual interactions, but not to human interactions in general. Like you can interact with people you don't love in all sorts of ways. Or if someone said sexual interactions must be geared toward reproduction, so you must intentionally hope to reproduce. Obviously, that's not going to apply to non-sexual interactions, right? As reproduction is just not possible through such interactions. Or the most prominent uniqueness view, one we'll return to a bit later, new natural law, is going to posit a basic good called the marital good, which is this 2-in-1 flesh union of husband and wife. And though it's posited as a basic good to which any situation could apply, it really is only going to come up in the sexual realm because we're talking about sort of sexual interactions. So we'll say a bit more about that later down in section 4. Then there's non-uniqueness views, which is sort of just a catch-all for applying the general moral principles that we'd apply in all interpersonal interactions to sexual interactions. You could put this in the following way, just saying, morally speaking, there's nothing special about sex compared to other human interactions. Now, there's certainly a difference in degree between other human interactions and sexual interactions, and that sexual interactions can involve much greater pleasures, much greater potential pains, harms, wrongs, etc. Like one philosopher, Thomas Mapes, back in the day, compared sexual interactions to other human interactions, saying, look, the rules governing when sex is morally permitted are the same as the rules governing when a game of tennis is morally permitted. So long as everyone consents, there's no extreme harm that will result, well, apply the same sorts of rules. And we shouldn't treat this minimalistically to simply say that sex is just insignificant. One philosopher, David Benatar, tried to make a distinction like this, and he talked about the casual view versus the significance view. And what he said, what that distinction makes it seem like is the liberal sexual morality says, well, sex is just like a game of tennis. So long as everyone agrees, go ahead and hit your balls around, I guess. But, John's the only one who let that jump. But there's great significance, obviously. Pains can be brought about that are much more significant than pains in other sort of interactions. Not talking here, of course, including psychological harms and psychological pains. And of course, can produce greater intimacy. It could serve as expression of love in ways that a game of tennis couldn't. Unless you're really into tennis, but it doesn't seem like it would work like that. Now, the two principles we're going to be most focused on in terms of wrong-making features of sexual interactions, and really all human interactions, because we're dealing with a non-uniqueness view, are going to be consent and harm. In general, someone doesn't consent to an interaction, morally wrong to engage in that interaction, whether we're talking sexual interaction or non-sexual interaction, or if some excessive harm is going to come about from that action. So if someone invites you to play a game of tennis, but you know that person has such a weak heart that if they overly exert themselves, they might die, well, it might be morally incumbent on you to say, no, I can't play with you. Similarly, in a sexual interaction, if someone's likely to die from an interaction, even if they want to engage in it, the harm's so great, it seems like it would be incumbent on you to say, no, you cannot engage in that interaction. So consent and harm are going to be the things I'm going to focus on most. I'm not going to say these are the only things that morally could be problematic with sexual interactions or human interactions in general, just that if you account for these, you're probably accounting for almost everything. And other sorts of objections are generally going to fall into one of these two categories. Now I'm going to assume the non-uniqueness view for the time being. We'll return to potential problems with uniqueness views a bit later. But for now, we're just going to assume the non-uniqueness view, which is more or less the prevalent view among sexual ethicists now. Obviously, popularity doesn't mean it's correct, but sort of the situation we're currently in. Now, it's worth at least noting one of the benefits of the non-uniqueness view, and that is it gets us the sort of things that seem like are morally permissible, that a lot of the uniqueness views would not allow. So acts like premarital casual sex, wherein you have partners consenting and no great harm is going to ensue, seems morally non-problematic. Well, non-uniqueness view can account for that. Or something like masturbation, non-uniqueness view can account for. Good comes out of it of pleasure, at least that's one of the goods, pleasure. Obviously one person's involved, so consent's not an issue. unlikely great harm will come out of it. Whereas uniqueness views are often, a lot of them are going to struggle to explain the moral permissibility of masturbation. What I mostly want to focus on is what the non-uniqueness view would say about what we'll just call taboo sexual interactions. I'm going to look at a few taboo sexual interactions. Don't have time for all of them. Probably won't even have time to get through all the objections considered here. But I want to look at some of these interactions because if we accept the non-uniqueness view, I think it's going to lead us pretty clearly to having to say that some of these interactions are morally permissible. How many? That's up for debate, but at least some. So here's a basic principle we're going to sort of work for. Now, I mean this to be a fairly weak principle. I think something might be stronger than this. That is, under 2bi, if these acts produce some good, even a minimalistic good like mere pleasure, while involving no countervailing wrongs, no overriding concerns, then they're going to be morally permissible. The basic stance I'm going to take is, for a good number of these acts, it's going to be the case that some goods produced, whether it's pleasure, or in some of them potentially production of intimacy, expression of love, and there's going to be situations we're going to try to knock down some of the potential overriding concerns, some of the potential countervailing wrongs that one might offer against a few of these acts. So let's deal with the question of, are there countervailing wrongs for every taboo sexual interaction? Now again, I can't deal with every single one, but we can sort of see the pattern of how responses are going to go here. But first I want to deal with two overarching objections one might offer against these acts. First of all, philosophers love to deal from intuition. If we didn't deal from intuition, I don't know how we could do philosophy. We'd probably just be doing science. And scientists have to use a lot of intuition too, even if they sometimes pretend like they don't. Now someone might say it's intuitively obvious these acts are morally impermissible. So you consider an act like incest. It just seems wrong. Let's imagine this is a genuine intuition, not just some conditioning of disgust that might have been built up in us through how we've been raised, or through society. Let's imagine this is a genuine intuition that these things seem wrong. Now, philosophers realize that an intuition isn't the be-all, end-all, right? It's not, I intuit X, so I accept X against all evidence. You can say nothing against X, I have intuited it. If we had perfect ways to intuit claims, intuit beliefs, then we'd be good to go. But of course our intuitions need to be tested, right? Among other things, our intuitions need to be tested for consistency. In my classes, when we deal with sexual ethics, I ask my students to give intuitive responses to a couple questions. And usually I get a lot of inconsistent responses. So the first question is, what is sex? Usually the response is something like, oh, penile-vaginal intercourse. There you go, penis, vagina, sex. Can two men have sex? Well, yeah, of course. Inconsistency, right? We're dealing with a definition of sex that then when we answer the question, can two men have sex, can two women have sex, we contradict. If our intuitions are inconsistent, we need to sacrifice something. My contention is that outright rejection of all of these taboo sexual interactions, that is, presumption that they are immoral, is inconsistent with the intuitive understanding of the primacy of consent and harm when determining the moral status of interpersonal interactions. That is, we have this really strong these really strong intuitions that something like harm is bad, or harm is by definition bad. More specifically, pain is bad, for example. There's no real great argumentation we can offer in favor of the claim pain is bad. I mean, if you want to put your hand on the desk, I'd like stab a pen in it and then ask you, is that bad? That's an example I think Bruce might use. And yeah, that's bad, right? Just the felt experience is enough of an argument to know pain is bad. Similarly with consent, one's autonomy over oneself just seems like such an important thing that overwhelming that, working against one's consent without some tremendous overriding reason, just seems wrong in and of itself. Well, if we're focused on these sorts of things as the general wrong-making features of acts, well then to say that all taboo sexual interactions are morally impermissible without investigating whether these concepts apply is simply just a mistake. We should test our intuitions concerning these acts and see if it actually follows that they're impermissible. Okay, maybe go faster. Second overarching objection is this worry about a character defect. So that one who would engage in some act like perhaps incest, so we're going to talk about necrophilia. And you never know when you come to one of my talks, but I'm going to bring up necrophilia. That this is a mark against one's character, and that performing the act shows that one has some attitudinal deficiency or some defect in one's moral character. I think this is putting the cart before the horse. I think this is begging the question against the wrongness of these acts. And basically, if you can't show that an act is wrong, it's going to be hard to show why performing that act would be a mark against one's character. If an act actually turns out to be permissible, it would be strange if performing that act was a mark against one's character. Unless one was perhaps convinced that it was impermissible. But if one thought it was permissible and it turns out to actually be permissible, performing it doesn't seem like it would be a mark against one's character at all. Now we're going to blow through B, C, and D. I'm not going to consider all the objections and replies for temporal concerns. But just generally, here's how it might go. So let's start off with perhaps the least taboo of the taboo interactions I'll mention today, and that's polygamy, more specifically polyamory. So polygamy is going to involve having multiple husbands or wives. Let's worry more about polyamory, where you just have a setup where there doesn't have to be any official recognition necessarily like you would get in polygamy. Now, the people are worried that this will fundamentally involve the subjugation of women. One response you can give to almost any objection you raise against these acts is the following. Even if this is true, there's going to be exceptions, or cases to which the objection won't apply. So even if polygamous arrangements wherein you have a husband with many wives necessarily involved misogyny, subjugation of women, even if that were the case, you could imagine polygamous arrangements that were set up in a different way. You could imagine a group marriage of, say, 4 men married to each other, 4 women married to each other. In such an arrangement, you're unlikely to have the sort of misogynistic words, right? Because you have genders completely separated. When it comes to incest, I remember growing up, if there was ever a question on whether incest was good, bad, morally permissible or not, it was always like a go-to, oh, birth defects. And I never really questioned it for like decades till I looked into it and thought about it a little bit here. When we think about this objection, it's a really strange one. Because first, it's only an objection against a very specific subset of sexual interactions, right? So if you're worried about incest producing birth defects, you're only worried about penile-vaginal intercourse between fertile partners. That's not contracepted and with no plans for abortion if abortion is permissible. That's like a really tiny subset, right? And ultimately, you're not even worried about the familial relations necessarily. You're worried about a deleterious combination of genes. But that could apply even without familial relations. So let's say a husband and wife getting married get some genetic testing done and realize that they have a deleterious combination of genes such that their child is likely to have significant birth defect. If you think this objection works against incest, then it works against that couple too. So it's really not ultimately about familial relations. This objection at least. Then you can also get objections that say that incest involves some disruption of familial bonds. That is, there is this, that familial bonds get upset in some morally problematic way. I'll be honest, when I've seen this written, I've never fully understood what exactly anyone was going for. Now it's worth noting there's not a huge incest literature in philosophy. Usually when this comes up, it's in relation to another discussion, like an objection against homosexual sex acts will be that justifying those gives justification for polygamy, incest, speciality. And then there'll be a few throwaway sentences on incest. So I'd really love to see this objection filled out, because I don't know what it could mean that wouldn't also exclude things that are morally non-problematic, like a wife moving 2 hours away for her job. Disrupts familial bonds. Imagine wife with a spouse and a family. But that's not problematic, right? Or a spouse deciding to go across the world for Doctors Without Borders, leaving his or her spouse behind with a couple kids. We might think this is a morally really good thing, but it's going to upset familial bonds. So I'd love to get conditions of what it means to upset familial bonds that's morally problematic, and what it would mean for it not to be morally problematic. And so we just haven't really got those conditions, and I struggle to think what exactly they would look like. So this objection doesn't do much for me. Even something as extreme as necrophilia, that is sex with a dead body. If we have very, very strong taboo on this one, probably as strong as any taboo we have. But it's actually pretty hard to justify why all such acts would be morally impermissible. I feel like this is the point at which I should remind everyone I'm not a necrophiliac, and I'm not arguing in favor of this lifestyle, but just trying to figure out the permissibility of the act. The biggest concern is consent. Yes, it would be wrong to have sex with a dead body without the person's prior consent. But it would be wrong to do all sorts of things to dead bodies without someone's consent. We think that if someone asks to be buried, that it might be wrong, except in exceptional circumstances, to cremate the body. We have certain say-so over our bodies after we die. Now, it's probably not a power we have that's just like this inalienable right. It's probably more culturally based. There's this expectation while you live that you will have this after your death, and all people have this expectation with each other. So people who survive have to fulfill these duties. But we generally think, though, that if someone says, you can do acts with my body afterwards, barring some overriding concern, that's just fine. I mean, someone says you can have my organs after I die, we get to cut someone open and take their organs. This would be a brutally evil thing to do to someone who was alive. We would think this is something that's wrong to do to someone who didn't give consent. That is, to do it after their death. But what if we imagine pre-death consent was given to a necrophiliac act? Why one would do this? I don't want to judge judgments here. I don't want to determine value for other people. But if one gives consent, then it's going to be fairly analogous to organ harvesting, where something that if we did it without consent would be morally problematic, here might be morally permissible. Okay. So we'll leave those other objections to the side so we can move on. But if you want to read through them, there's detail enough there, or we can talk during Q&A or afterward. But it's worth considering the following. You could imagine someone, after I make this argumentation, saying, I think you've just given me good reason to reject the non-uniqueness view. If you tell me the non-uniqueness view means some necrophiliac acts, some incestuous acts, other taboo acts I didn't even mention, are going to be morally permissible, well, then I should just reject the view. And I agree that these things are counterintuitive, or at least at first. They come off as counterintuitive. The worry is I don't think there's any other better options. Because if you reject the non-uniqueness view and adopt some uniqueness view, you leave yourself rejecting a lot more than most people wish to. So again, the most prominent, probably worth saying the most sort of philosophically viable uniqueness view is new natural law. New natural law is going to say that the only permissible sexual interaction that you can have is going to be between a husband and wife, married, monogamous, with a full lifelong commitment, having penile-vaginal intercourse, uncontracepted, while being open to procreation. So, just excluded premarital sex, open marriages, masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, mutual masturbation, all contraception would be morally impermissible. And this goes counterintuitive the other way. So there's this worry that the non-uniqueness view seems to allow way too much. But then there's a worry the other way, where the uniqueness views are going to seem to allow way too little. And it's going to seem to be true for most uniqueness views I've run across. And so what are we to do? How are we going to decide between one extreme or the other? Well, one thing worth noting is the non-uniqueness view makes sure to start from plausible moral principles. Consent, harm, pleasure, things like this. With uniqueness views, you usually get an extra sort of principle that is not as plausible. So new natural law offers the marital good, which says you must fulfill this 2 in 1 flesh union of husband and wife. That doesn't seem basic or as plausibly basic as something like pain is bad, pleasure is good. So there's a bit of metaphysical baggage that uniqueness views are going to take. Or a view that said all sexual interactions must be geared toward reproduction. It doesn't seem as basically plausible as if you claim like you should not violate another's consent or something like that. So just from the very fact that the non-uniqueness view starts us from more plausible principles, it's a big mark in its favor. And we might end up in seemingly implausible spots no matter what view we take. But it's worth noting, we start from plausible principles. We shouldn't be shocked if sometimes the application of those principles takes us to unexpected places. And I think basically that's what happens here. Final concern. Let's imagine everything I said is completely true. I'm not assuming it is. I hope some humility here. Let's imagine it were true. And we all agreed on this. We're like, we need to go share these truths as good philosophers, academics, etc. There's still an issue. Yes, I'm serving as a philosopher, and in that role I have certain duties. Among those duties, a couple listed, to try to figure out what's true. I mean, that's probably a good duty for anyone, but especially a philosopher. Try to figure out what is true, what is false, believe those true things. And then contribute one's findings to the community at large, specifically the philosophical community at large. But that duty might run into conflict with my duty as a moral agent, with, among a bunch of other duties, at least this one, don't cause undue harm. There's a legitimate worry that wide propagation of these sorts of claims would lead to the removal of all taboo on sexual interactions. This would be a bad result, right? Because arguing that some incestuous interactions are morally permissible is not the same as saying all incestuous actions are morally permissible. And there's a worry that these aren't promulgated in the right way, not dispersed in the right way, or you can expect there will be misunderstandings when any view is spread. There's worries that you can cause great harm, and oftentimes great harm to extremely vulnerable people. And so then the question becomes, what do we do with this conflict? And I don't have a great answer. I wish there was no conflict. That's my first answer. So again, the conflict is, just to reemphasize this, spreading these claims, even if true, likely to lead to misunderstanding. You can predict that there will be a good level of misunderstanding, whereby perhaps there's going to be conclusions where people think, oh, all sexual interactions are just fine now. And then, of course, this can lead to harm to children. It can lead to assaults like rape and various other sexual assaults, problematic things like this. Now, I don't have a solution. I have a couple preliminary thoughts. Context matters, obviously. Like, I don't know, if I was going to, like, if I was invited to a middle school to, like, talk to students about ethics, I wouldn't bring any of this up. And that's pretty obvious. Or when my friend John gives talks, debates with people on the moral permissibility of homosexuality, and someone says, but what about incest and bestiality, polygamy? If he said, oh yeah, those are fine, that loses a lot of the impact he's trying to get with the audience of opening people's minds to this first thing that's morally permissible. So context certainly matters, and I'll speak differently on these subjects when I'm talking with, say, my fellow philosophers versus when I'm talking with an intro class. And that seems reasonable to me. So I'm at least comfortable saying context matters. Outside of that, I don't know what should be given greater concern here. Should I just fall back and say, I'm a philosopher, I find out truths, I spread the truths as I see them, and let the chips fall where they where they might. Well, doing that seems to really be abrogating my responsibility as a moral agent to act correctly, to do the morally right thing. If I know harm will come from doing that, then it seems like I shouldn't. But then again, we might ask about the source of the harm. If the source of the harm is not the views itself, but some misunderstanding, then would the one who spreads the views bear the burden for it? If you can foresee the misunderstanding, does that count against you? I'm not entirely sure. Especially when it comes to this topic, I'm really not sure. So, if anyone has an answer to that, I would love to hear that. If not, any questions, comments, anything you have, good to go.
So I know you're mostly talking about the moral stuff, but I wanted to just make a comment about the legal stuff, because I think it ties into what ethicist duties are here. I can kind of see the view that, look, a lot of laws exist to prohibit things that aren't so bad if one person does them, but are bad if they become widespread, so traffic laws are like this, right? And I think you can make an argument that, yeah, one-off incest, probably permissible, but there's also a reason why we don't want people doing repeated incest. There is a public health problem if you have generations and generations of children born from incest, and saying gay people can commit incest but straight people can't strikes most people as discriminatory. So it makes sense, you think, to have a law that just says incest should be illegal. And you can make a similar case for necrophilia. There's a public health concern. There's dead bodies are unprotected in a way that live bodies are not. And so you say, look, there's good reasons for these laws, and then the ethicists maybe should be hesitant to make these arguments in public because they would undermine what is sound public policy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, when I say some taboo sexual interactions are morally permissible, I don't mean to say we should remove the taboo. And then especially shouldn't remove laws that, now perhaps we shouldn't, and we generally don't, like vociferously go after people breaking these laws. Yeah, so that might be a good reason why just keep quiet. And then what do? Do we just talk about it with each other and be like, oh, if only people could understand, or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we do this with torture, right? So there are situations where torture might be permissible, but ethicists aren't supposed to say that to rooms full of CIA agents because they'll just see them everywhere, right? So when we're talking to CIA agents, we just lie and say, you should never torture. And when we're at the philosophy conference, we come up with bizarre hypothetical scenarios in which torture seems like the right thing to do.
Right,
So
all of our scenarios were like, imagine you could get the information, and that's not applicable to the real world.
Yeah.
Just to sort of follow up on Ryan's point and your response to it, you said that you're not saying that we ought to remove the taboo from these things by saying that they're permissible sometimes, but isn't that just what that does? I mean, we say they're permissible sometimes. The whole notion of a taboo, and maybe my question is about the notion of a taboo. The whole notion of a taboo is that there are some things that are just not done, period, end of story, and that by sort of saying, it might be permissible here and it might be permissible here, precisely what we're doing is undermining the taboo.
So I kind of played fast and loose with the word taboo, and I try not to give a perfect definition. I don't want to remove societal-wide taboos. Well, let me say this. If I could wave a magic wand and make everyone perfectly understand these claims I think are true while not overshooting them, being like, oh, that means that I would do that. I understand that can't happen. And so, yeah, maybe I shouldn't even be giving this talk. Maybe
that was not my point, just to be clear.
No, so I want the societal taboo, but I also would like to, how about this? I don't want a widespread removal of the taboo, but if we can have a gradual chipping away through slowly changing minds, that might mitigate the damage. I don't know. Again, this is the aspect I don't feel like I have good answers on. Yeah.
Sure. I have more questions, but I want to let other people.
Really? I didn't want to have the philosophy department dominate this discussion.
Well. All right, so on page 2, you didn't talk much about B2B, you're talking about the polygamy taboo and the harm to children argument, and you say, in responding to the harm to children argument, you say the choice isn't between the child living with monogamous parents or living with polygamous parents. The choice is often between the child living with polygamous parents or the child never having existed. And that sounds vaguely like something I say in another context. And so what I wanted to push back against here is I'm not sure it works in this context for the following reason. So you have, let's use traditional polygamy here. Husband, wife number one has child number one, wife number two has child number two, wife number three has child number three. Why can't you say, look, it would be better for child number one if there were just wife number one and not wife number two and wife number three? It's not clear to me how that choice gets forced that you say here.
I would say even if that were true, I wonder more, like, what's the moral implication of that? It's not, is it, okay, you must divorce the other two wives and leave the other two children fatherless? Is it, we take those children away and put them in better homes? Like, I would say even if it is better, there's no real moral option. So like the key is, it's not, we're talking about adoption into polygamous families. This would make more sense. If there were ample people that were potentially adopting, and we were talking about adoption into polygamous families, we might be worried about what's the best for the child. But if it is, oh, polygamous arrangements are problematic for children and that it's bad for them in whatever way, harmful, their psyches, whatever it might be. Well, when you're talking about this, like projecting into the future, you're asking, would it be better for this child, it's a strange question because you're comparing to non-existence, would it be better for this child to exist in a polygamous arrangement or not at all? I think so long as polygamous arrangement is above some minimally satisfying life, it's not so bad that the child has a negative net value, which we don't see why it would be in this case, or why it would necessarily be for polygamous cases, then the objection just really is going to apply there.
I think I agree with you, and to make it clear, I'm skeptical about the empirical claim that children are worse off in polygamous arrangements. If anything, they might be better off having multiple mothers around. But it seems to me that what we're thinking about here is contemplating whether, as a society, we ought to embrace polygamy as opposed to monogamy, and it seems at least plausible for somebody to make the argument that if we had empirical evidence that child well-being were less in polygamous societies than in monogamous societies, we'd have, all else being equal, a reason to favor monogamy. I think that would be the argument, not that this particular child would be better off had, you know.
Yeah, on a societal basis, that would at least give us initial prima facie reason. Of course, it's not a popular thing to say, other people's concerns matter besides children. So we want to know happiness levels of the parents involved, overall well-being for society. If for some reason having polygamous families meant people were more productive, more inventive, whatever it might be, produce greater advancements. And that would be a really complicated empirical question to answer. But yeah, that would at least be some evidence against the societal promotion of it in a societal arrangement.
Oh, well, if somebody else wants to go first, I would definitely defer. This is about the disruption of familial bonds thing. So I can see a very strong case being made for that in the parent-child case because there's this story that this woman philosopher tells about finding out her PhD advisor had a crush on her, and this was devastating because she now questioned whether or not a lot of the compliments she got were, you know, in order to get some kind of affection or something like that. And you might think part of the parent-child relationship is supposed to be really just unconditional bond and support, and it's not trying to win over any kind of sexual affection. And so it's helpful or important that sexual relationships just be taken off the table in the parent-child relationship. So I think in that case, there's a disruption of familial bonds.
I feel comfortable agreeing with all of that.
Okay.
So I find it easier with the incestuous cases just to, I mean, when you imagine the easiest cases, to at least get someone to say, oh yeah, that one, so some are. To go as far away from an example like that as possible. Right. Where you have like brother and sister separated at birth, not raised together. You remove the familial bond issue at all. Now it's just, oh, these genetic codes are too close. Like what more work is that doing? But I agree when there is, the parent-child relationship seems like the best candidate for the disruption of familial bonds, and that intuitively seems quite plausible to me. campers.
So I agree with all these remarks about laws have to take account of the general harms or maybe benefits that this kind of action, if it's permitted, and that's relevant to determining whether there should be this sort of law or not. But I also think what happens is that sometimes the laws are too broadly construed, that a more narrowly construed law might not have those harmful consequences. Here's an example. So I talk about active euthanasia when I'm teaching medical ethics, and people say, well, you could have these bad consequences, you know, people end up killing their uncle for the inheritance and stuff like that. And I say, yeah, but you know what, if you agree that there's some good to be had by allowing voluntary euthanasia, maybe we can have it both ways by building in safeguards, making sure that people have to, you know, go through some kind of review and can't do this right away and have to consult with doctors and so on and so forth. So you can more narrowly craft the law so that the benefits can be had that would be denied if you had a broader law. At the same time, you can protect against the harms that are being worried about. So I wondered, I don't know, maybe something like this with respect to incest. Well, we don't want child-parent incest. That ought to be illegal. But maybe other kinds, brother, sister, or something like that. And a further point along the same lines, that as circumstances change, that when a law was a good law given these circumstances, it may not be now. What do I have in mind? I have in mind that laws against premarital sex, maybe, when there wasn't contraceptive means to protect against unwanted pregnancies, made sense about prevent the harm that's envisioned. But now there's a lot of contraceptive protection, so that law would no longer have the rationale that it had. So in general, I accept Ryan's point, about there's one thing about laws, another thing about particular acts and exceptions and so forth. But also I think you have to be careful that laws don't get a kind of, inertia that there is this law there and there was a good reason at one point in history, but now there ain't.
Yeah, so I agree with the general thrust of what you're saying. I worry that the distinction we could draw between the euthanasia case and the other cases is in the euthanasia case we could put in institutional safeguards. Right? Like euthanasia we're not letting take place in the home.
Yeah.
With these sorts of acts, there's not institutional safeguards. It's each private citizen to sort of realize what the law is and apply it for him or herself. So maybe carving out the law in a different way would open up problems for those cases that wouldn't happen with the euthanasia case. I mean, that's, again, empirically could be figured out. Probably should try to figure it out before we change the laws. But so without the institutional safeguards, I worry that we're going to have this sort of slippage where it would be this sort of breakdown of, oh, incest is just fine now. I can do what I want. So I'm concerned. But I definitely agree we shouldn't deify laws and just say, okay, no, this is just how our culture is. We don't want to change that. But we'll let people break laws so long as we can keep this overall sort of, hey, this is the law, do this.
I was recommending kind of two different solutions. One's the safeguard one. The other one is narrowing the law, but not completely outlawing certain kinds of incest.
What would be a major harm for children brought up, excuse me, in a gay family?
I'm sorry, one more time, I have trouble hearing.
What would be a major harm that would affect the child in a gay relationship?
I wouldn't think there would be any. So you're saying two gay parents with a child?
Yeah.
Harms people have said in the past, John could list way more of them than me, but the worry is that you need both a mother and a father to be raised well-adjusted, that mothers provide things, fathers can't, fathers provide things, mothers can't. None of this seems all that plausible, and there's actually growing social scientific data that sort of disputes that children of gay couples are worse off. So I would just say, perhaps there's some slight things that are worse, some slight things that are better, not entirely sure there. I would say nothing morally problematic here at all.
So you say that like a big one of the objections to it is that they need both a mother and a father. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's worries, really want to just call out John here like I'm a teacher. There's worries like that the child ends up worse off in terms of being this sort of well-developed, well-rounded child if it lacks a mother and or father. And so like, if you have two fathers, you won't have what the mother provides. If you have two mothers, you won't have what the father provides. Again, this is probably adopting a gender construct that just doesn't exist. Fathers are like this, mothers are like this. I mean, there's probably, depending on your mother and father is, you were probably getting some things exceptionally well that they did, other things not as well. I mean, then another set of parents might have done things, different things exceptionally well, other things not as well. It's not like all men are going to do something equally well, all women do a completely different thing equally well, and you need both of them to be well adjusted. And more, the social science data just does not back that up. It just does not back up that children of gay parents or lesbian parents are worse off. So it's not really a concern.
I'm actually from two gay parents.
Okay.
That's why I was asking you. I feel that me and my sister have actually had more opportunities and raised in a more loving and welcoming environment to not only be ourselves, but to pursue and do what we want in life. And,
Okay,
sorry.
I believe you. Anything else?
Again, I want to let other
Yes,
people
that's a
go.
big time.
Philosophy seminar here.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking a little bit more about the notion of taboo and why we have taboos. So this is going to be one of those questions that's really me thinking out loud and then sort of like raising my whole pitch at the end to make it sound like a question. You know how that works. So part of why we have taboos is that certain things are tempting, and sometimes we're tempted to take risks that we would be better off not tempting, so we say, look, certain things should not be done. So for example, we say you shouldn't have sex with students. Why? Well, okay, you can understand why it's bad to have sex with your own students, because there's the power imbalance and there's the potential for abuse of grade. It's like, okay, well, what about other students at the university? Well, other students could eventually become your students. Well, what about students who are in different programs who can't become your students? Yeah, but you could still be, and you can go far enough down the line where it's like, okay, maybe that's not such a big deal. But if we say it's okay to have sex with some students, then there's a likelihood that people are going to keep skating too close to the line, and that's dangerous, so we say no sex with students. You can make the same kind of argument with respect to colleagues and so on, but the point is that it's not so much that we were trying to say that this is absolutely impermissible or absolutely wrong. It's just the further you go this way, the more and more it becomes a bad idea. And so you have this sort of scalar view where better choices versus worse choices, not an absolute line. But we draw an absolute line because we know that people are tempted to skate too close to the worst choices. When I think about the incest question, I think about it this way because you might say, look, you can sketch cases where, well, I don't really see the problem here. But you can see why there's an argument why it's a bad idea to start introducing this into families because unlike, students who can stop being my student or boyfriends or girlfriends who can stop being my boyfriend or girlfriend, I mean, there's a sense in which I can sort of disown my sister and say, you're not my sister anymore. But it's much harder to break those bonds and much more costly to break those bonds if we presume a certain value of familial bonds. And so I wonder if part of the reason we have the taboos is to just, because we know human nature and we know people's tendency to take risks that they'd be better off not taking, we say, look, just don't.
Yeah.
What do you think? And that's the question.
So there's a positive case in favor of just maintaining the taboo. But the way you were describing the taboo sounded just rubbed me strange. It's sounded like we're the taboo makers. We build the taboos for people to live under. But people who accept the taboo, they don't usually accept it for the sort of reasons you just said. It's usually more this unreflective taboo means bad, which that makes me want to think, well, we need to just break these taboos because we're letting people just believe things that are false. that, oh, this thing's always bad. And then again, this is my philosopher overtaking my moral agent right now saying,
Yeah.
let's convince them of the true things and work it out from there.
Yes, no, I agree with you. We don't come up with the taboos by saying, let's work this out. I'm saying if we were to have a rationale for
Yeah.
taboos, it's like why I might have a rationale for certain absolute rules of I'm not going to have any dessert this month, because if I say I'm just going to have a little bit of dessert, I know myself, I'm not going to, or if I'm going to have just 3 potato chips, no, it never works that way. I'm going to finish the bowl with potato chips, so it's better for me to just say no potato chips. And I'm wondering if this is partly how taboos function, right? We know that people are inclined to take risks, especially with things like sex, which have a powerful reinforcing capacity, right? Sex feels really, really good, and then it becomes really, really tempting. So better for us to have these absolute prohibitions, even though morality doesn't really work that way when we look at it carefully.
Yeah, and if that's the case, we should have that absolute prohibition, have a taboo. Should have set a shredder up by the door, everyone shred their sheets on the way out. Don't let us get out, because we need to maintain the taboo. Again, from minute to minute, I feel pulled different ways.
Yeah.
Like as a moral agent, I know that like if tomorrow like everyone like read this, that would be bad. It would lead to great harms for people. And I don't want that. But as a philosopher, it's like, well, it'd be great if I could have everyone, not just like for fame, everyone read my work, but it'd be great if the things I thought were true and been working on and arguing for, if people would read them and consider them, and a bunch of people would accept them. So I don't know which role I should act from minute to minute.
Yeah. And I wasn't doing this as a sort of challenge with respect to what you should do, but more just as sort of a general way of thinking about taboos.
I have one more comment about taboos.
Let's slide it over.
I agree with John that those would be rational taboos. I think the question, even if you accept there are rational taboos for the reasons that John gave, about where exactly the line should be drawn on these cases about polygamy and I don't know, necrophilia and stuff like that. Maybe the taboos that we currently have don't meet the standards, basically, that John is giving for having a rational taboo. I don't know about polygamy, really. I think often it's not just the children polygamy, but people feel that in the case of when there's one man and many women, that the women end up not having, I don't know, equal say or equal respect in the relationships, and those are bad things. And so there are other reasons to have some kind of a prohibition against polygamy. I don't really know whether those empirical claims are true. My general point is, accepting what John says about rational taboos, it still leaves you room to reassess whether the taboos that we currently accept meet the conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's worth noting in relation to this, taboos shift over time, and should we just let them sort of shift naturally, or if we can shift them with argumentation, would that be better? And it's also worth saying, perhaps this worry about all these harms coming out of it's a bit overblown. You know, sexual revolution, in the middle of last century, people thought would just lead to the utter, a lot of people argue, would lead to the utter teardown of sort of all sexual ethics in this society. And it just didn't follow. You could imagine people arguing, if people did way back in the day, if we start to allow contraceptives, well, people would just become these sex-crazed monsters, we'll lose all sort of any sexual ethic that we have. Same with homosexuality, another taboo that is gradually being torn away. So maybe these fears are overblown. Maybe I should trust that people are way more understanding and way more able to grasp these nuances, and it wouldn't lead to this tremendous turnout. So perhaps, though still good reason to think some harm would result, it wouldn't be as widespread as worried. And that's the case, well, it's more reason to think should try to just promulgate the truth and let things go from there.
But Tim, my point was that given what John says, maybe in the general public even, you can say there are rational taboos, and yet if you're looking at acts, there are exceptions to them. That's my view, that there are always these exceptions, but some taboos are rational and some aren't, and you could say that. It seems like something that's doesn't, I don't know, it depends on what people, maybe you think that if people think they're rational taboos, that then they'll draw their own or something, I don't know. But it sounds like something you could say that's true that says that there are rational taboos, but as far as acts, there are also exceptions to these taboos where those acts are morally permissible.
Yeah, I think that's all.
I don't know, maybe it's dangerous because people say, oh yeah, I know that taboo against student-faculty relationships, but I'm an exception. I don't know.
And John mentioned earlier, there is something in contention here when you say, oh, that's a rational good taboo. But of course, sometimes it's permissible. Like, it seems like you're working against it being a rational taboo. So,
Not really. I mean,
I generally agree.
I think that's what the Act Utilitarian says about rules of thumb. There are these rules of thumb that are really important because often there's a lot of utility associated with violating them. But of course, they're rules of thumb. That means they're in extreme circumstances. Utility would say you don't have to adhere to them.